You didn't lose your childhood by accident. You were trained early because you were assigned early. And what broke you as a child is what God now uses as proof. Proof number 1. You were forced to mature because protection wasn't guaranteed. Some children grow slowly, others grow sharp. Not because they were gifted, but because safety was inconsistent. Scripture shows this pattern clearly. Joseph did not grow up sheltered. He grew up aware, rejected by brothers, stripped of favor, forced into responsibility before explanation. Psalm 66:10 says, "For you, God, tested us. You refined us like silver." Refining always happens under heat, and when responsibility arrives before rest, it is rarely an accident. Here is the truth most people never hear. God does not assign early weight to fragile vessels. He assigns it to future carriers. That early maturity wasn't cruelty. It was preparation before understanding. You weren't rushing life. Life was preparing you. Proof number 2. You learned independence early because dependence would have broken you. Chosen ones often stop asking for help young, not out of pride, out of necessity. When support is inconsistent, asking becomes risky. So the nervous system adapts. It learns to rely inward instead of outward. Silence feels safer than expectation. Doing it alone feels more reliable than hoping someone will stay. David learned to fight alone in the fields before he ever faced Goliath. No audience, no applause, no backup. Only responsibility, repetition, and God. 1 Samuel 17 shows David already trained in solitude before public victory ever came. Early independence is not rebellion. It is adaptation. Here is the deeper truth. God often allows self-reliance early, so false reliance never forms later. So that when people fail you, and they will, your faith does not collapse with them. Now you understand why help still feels unfamiliar, why rest feels unsafe, why dependence feels like weakness instead of relief. You weren't hardened, you were trained. But training is not meant to be permanent housing. Proof number 3. Your emotional restraint was developed before your softness was allowed. You learned to stay calm while things fell apart. You learned to read rooms instead of being held in them. You learned when to stay quiet long before you learned how to be comforted. Luke 2:52 says, "And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." Wisdom came first. Favor came later. Chosen ones often develop perception before protection, awareness before safety, discernment before nurture. This is why you rarely explode, why you stay composed when others panic, why your emotions learn discipline before expression. But here is the insight most people miss. Emotional restraint formed under pressure becomes strength later, but only when softness is finally allowed to return. What felt like emotional deprivation was spiritual calibration. God trained you to carry authority without being ruled by emotion. Now He teaches you how to feel without losing control. That balance is not common. It is forged. Proof number 4. Rest feels unsafe because chaos trained your nervous system. When life was quiet, something usually followed. So your system learned vigilance. The Bible calls this watching. Isaiah 62:6 says, "I have posted watchmen on your walls. They will never be silent day or night." Watchmen don't rest deeply. They remain alert. Now you understand why stillness feels suspicious, why peace feels temporary, why calm makes your body brace instead of settle. This isn't brokenness. It's unfinished transition. God trained you to stand guard early. Now He is teaching you how to sit without fear. Vigilance was training. It was never meant to be home. Proof number 5. You carry guilt when receiving care because you learned to be the provider. Many chosen ones feel wrong being held, wrong resting, wrong needing. If you were the strong one early, usefulness became safety. Being needed meant being secure. So receiving now feels unfamiliar, even threatening. Moses learned leadership before he learned trust. And it took 40 years in the desert before God softened what Egypt hardened. Exodus 3 shows God calling Moses not when he was powerful, but when he was empty enough to listen. Here is the deeper consequence. When worth was once tied to responsibility, rest begins to feel undeserved. Support feels like burdening others. Care feels like weakness. But God never related to you through usefulness. He relates to you through sonship. The payoff is this. The moment you stop proving your value, healing accelerates. Because God does not heal what is still performing. You were trained to give before you were taught to receive. Now receiving becomes the final lesson. Proof number 6. Your empathy is sharp because you learned to read danger early. You sense shifts before words, tension before explanation, atmosphere before action. This is not coincidence. It is perception trained under pressure. Jesus did the same. John 2:24-25 says, "But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew what was in man." Discernment always precedes trust. Chosen ones often feel deeply, but selectively, because caring without boundaries once cost too much. So empathy became precise instead of open-ended. Here is the key insight. God did not sharpen your perception to isolate you. He sharpened it to protect you. Your guarded empathy is not coldness. It is calibrated compassion. You learned where to feel and where not to bleed. Now God does not ask you to unlearn discernment. He asks you to let him decide who deserves access. Proof number 7. God allowed early pressure because your calling cannot tolerate immaturity. Chosen ones are not raised gently. They are forged carefully. Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I appointed you." Appointment comes before comfort. Calling comes before explanation. What felt unfair was preparation. What felt heavy was training. God did not rush your childhood to harm you. He accelerated your formation to protect what you carry. See, hear the final truth about the psychology of a chosen child who grew up too fast. If you grew up too fast, it doesn't mean you were robbed. It means preparation started early. But hear this clearly. What trained you for survival is not meant to define your future. God allowed wait early so he could trust you, chosen one, with rest later. You were strong because you had to be. Now you are safe enough to soften, and that is not weakness. That is completion.